for the conference. So it's the first time we have introduced a soft science track into the conference. Usually, most of the tracks that you are available to us are all very, very technical, very hard. But for this particular conference, we chose to introduce something that's a little more soft. Actually, in fact, it's actually important because without leadership skills, a lot of the hard stuff cannot be implemented. So, for those of you who were at the opening session, and I spoke a little bit about what the CSPC does, I mentioned blue, right? So, other than the hard stuff which we do very well, so we enable, accelerate digital research infrastructure, what we also want to focus on at the CSPC is the very blue. So, we'll contribute to research practice through applied research. So at the CSPC, our focus is not so much on pure science, but more on applied science. And so what we want to do is create new knowledge, get insights into practical problems and finding solutions to practical problems. So this particular track is kind of the start of what we're going to see more of is internal research happening at the CSPC where we're going to solve practical problems. So it might be in the leadership space, it might be in a technical space, it might be in a both combined, but it's really about how we're solving these practical problems using the insights and the skills that we have. And so today's talk is really about emerging leadership practices in the deployment of digital research infrastructure in Africa. And that's kind of the topic, and I just want to kind of share with you 5 ideas, right? 5 key ideas around what is happening within the digital leadership space as we kind of are looking at implementing and deploying digital research infrastructure. So 5 simple ideas which I'll share, and then those of you who want to kind of have a conversation, we can briefly talk a little bit more about that. A disclaimer, so leadership is an embodied practice. Right? It is a complex phenomenon. And so all of us are exposed to the idea of leadership, or the concept of leadership, through jobs that we've had, through positions that we've held. And so we all have views and ideas about leadership. So it's complex. And so what you might hear today might not kind of resonate with you as much, but I want to say to you that I understand. It's complex and it's embodied. And I also want to say is that leadership development, so if you're on a leadership development path, I want you to also understand that it's contextually important to consider social context, your own career path, the organization that you're in, but also understand that it's an evolving topic. So a lot of the leadership discussions that you want to kind of participate in, remember that leadership evolves over time and it has an impact on you as an individual. And so let me take you started by saying the following. So the question I want to ask us all is that how do we change the world? Right? So in the scientific community, in the space that we're in as scientists and as engineers, one of the things that place you in this kind of a space is that you want to change the world, right? You want to do research. You want to kind of grow and understand how a phenomenon works and how it actually is implemented. You want to come up with new knowledge, create new knowledge. That's kind of what you want to do. So you want to change the world. And if you remember our beloved Nelson Mandela, he's revered for changing the world at a particular time in history. But I also want to point out to you that the question that we're going to ask is, back in 1994, is that model of how to change the world still relevant in 2023? And further to that, is that in our own space, in deploying digital infrastructure, in working in the space of digital, what is the appropriate leadership model that's going to help us, enable us to do that? And I want to kind of point out an interesting fact is that over the past years, leadership has changed. And you probably are aware of it intuitively, but if you think of back in the past, leadership had a very heroic view, right? We revered heroes, right? Because the hero is what will come and save the day. And so the earlier days of leadership was really there around the hero. It was focused really on the individual. They had very specific skills, and in most cases, probably divinely appointed. Right? And so a lot of the literature was formed around the hero. Okay? And I kind of unpack that a bit later on. And as time evolved, we moved beyond the hero. So we moved beyond the hero leadership into what we call the post-hero leadership, which is more about the team. It's more about the organization. It's more about building capacity around the organization as opposed to focusing on the individual. And this kind of just shows you a map of how we've shifted from hero leadership to kind of where we are now in what we call the post-hero leadership. So just starting and just going through briefly, so in the heroic leadership model, the focus was on the individual, the boss. I mean, you remember even there was a sitcom called The Boss. And the nomenclature which kind of entered into the organization at the time was, I'm the boss and you my staff, right? I lead you. It was focused a lot about my traits, my personal traits. What capabilities, what competencies do I possess as an individual? Because that gave me power. And I use that power to kind of control, manipulate, orchestrate my team. And the object was the following. You had subjects that you kind of coordinated. But I mean, if you think about the heroic leadership model, that goes back to probably early years, where if you wanted to conquer a city, you would kind of get the strongest person you could, and the strongest individual will kind of round up a bunch of soldiers, and they will go and take over and conquer land. So that type of idea of the hero is actually, in fact, was the early literature. But obviously, as things have moved on, there was kind of this change in how we viewed leadership. And so we came to the next kind of a stage, or the next phase of it. Some call it the next wave of leadership, where it became more relational. And here was a focus on the trust between the employer and the manager. And it was really around how do you kind of ensure that this trust relationship is built between the employee and the manager. And the result of that relationship was collaboration, so working together. So we start to really see at this point, there's this notion of collaboration, working together, building trust. We kind of then move on to another kind of a thinking, which is called the pluralistic leadership model. And that was focused, that was the first time we started to introduce distributed leadership. So we went from one individual having all the power, kind of to the start of kind of sharing the power, to the third way, which actually in fact now we are distributing the power. Now me as a manager, I kind of don't have all the power, but actually in fact the power is vested across the organization. And that kind of brings you into the third way. So it's about the capability that's been distributed across the organization, not just vested in one individual. And so things like teams, networks start to emerge, collective capability. You know, we've probably heard this before. The collective, right? That's kind of where this terminology comes from. And the object was social capital. Some of you might have heard this before. But are you building social capital? Well, how do you build social capital? You build it through establishing networks within your organization. And through those networks, you use the networks to get things done. Right? So that's what we call is social capital. And the outcome of this type of leadership is really to produce a collective achievement. So the focus here was, how do we get things done? Not me as the boss, not me as the manager, but how do we get things done? There was a kind of a big shift, right, from the early days when the boss said, I'm going to influence and motivate and engage you so that I can get something done. Because you just my kind of my subordinates. To this post-heroic world where it is now distributed and we are going to get things done. And the current practice, the most recent practice as of today, is called leadership as a practice. So we've shifted completely away from what was seen as what is called the leader-follower model to what we're focused on now. So the focus now is more on leadership, is strategic. But leadership essentially is no longer just about an activity, but it's now about a process. Right? And the object it is a combination of what we saw before. So it's about collaboration, it's about relational building, but really what it does, it actually calls on what they call the leaderful practice. So now you have this notion that leadership as a process has moved to actually fact, it's actually something you're going to do. It's something that you engage with. It's something that you interact with. It's not something that kind of you possess. So I'm a leader because I have leadership competencies. No, no, no. You're a leader because you engage in a social context with activities, with actual fact things that you can use to achieve certain outcomes. And I'll kind of unpack this because this is important to understand. There's actually fact what we call leaderful practices. So a leader in an organization engages with leaderful practices in order to get things done. And those leaderful practices is stuff we all can do. It's not just about me doing it, but actually, in fact, the whole organization can engage in leaderful practices. So let's kind of look at that, because that is the most current leadership ideas around. LAP, right? And here's this notion of leaderful practices. And it comprises of four things. Now, some of the things you probably think, I've heard that, seen that before. You're probably all right. You probably have heard about the 4 C's. You probably have, at some point in your experience, been exposed to concurrent, collective, collaborative, and compassionate. But I think what I'm trying to show you is where it's kind of stemming from. Where is this ideas and these thoughts of leadership kind of coming from? And so maybe just to show you that leadership practice is basically consists of these 4 tenets. And they form the foundation for fostering a culture of collective leadership, which you heard before, which came about in wave 3, wave 2, innovation, engagement with teams, and across teams, and across the entire organization. So now you're beginning to see that leadership is actually in fact now not just bringing one individual to a point of a leader, not just maybe a team, but actually in fact now beginning to actually incorporate the whole organization. So all of us are engaged in leadership. And all of us are doing very particular things that will allow us to get to the outcome. So what do? We collaborate. Yeah? Creating an environment where individuals work together across the departments and hierarchies. Why? Because it fosters collective agreement, collective innovation, creativity, a sense of shared ownership. So we're sharing in the outcome of what we're trying to achieve as a group. We are communicating, all of us. Right? We communicate. What does communicate does? Well, it helps me understand what my role and responsibility is. We coordinate. We organize tasks, right? We set agendas so that we can achieve desired outcomes. We make sure there's alignment between all of us. And then we build community, right? Creating a supportive environment for individuals to feel valued. And this is important, valued, respected, and included. We're all doing that, not just the line manager, your line manager, but all of us are doing that because we all are participating in what they are calling now leaderful practices. However, having said all of that, what is also happening within our space that we are working in is that technology is impacting on the way leadership is being practiced. So yes, you have these, what we call these 4 ways of leadership that has kind of emerged over time. You have a current leadership model, which is called leadership as a practice, which is probably the most current version. But also at the same time, with digital transformation taking place within our organizations, changing workplace environments, you have leadership being impacted. And so the literature shows us that in the old days, in the industrial economy, we had very much a command and control, which you think back, that was the heroic one, wasn't it? This command and control during the Industrial Revolution was very much the heroic leader. So I'm the commander and I control my subjects. But we're moving into this knowledge economy and creative economy, where we have to communicate, we have to connect. And we saw these constructs earlier on, isn't it? We saw it in the previous waves of leadership. And then lastly, the creative economy, more co-creation, 5 minutes. Hey. So what is the literature telling us? Is that as a result of digital transformation, you have a new leadership paradigm that's emerging. So you have the 4 ways, but yet very specifically in organizations that are engaged in transformation around digital, there's this very specific type of leadership skill that's required in order to ensure that those digital transformation processes are successful. And this is kind of what the literature has kind of formulated. So you need digital vision, able to create a digital vision for your organization. You need a digital mindset, and you need a digital skill set. But that's all great, right? So on the one hand, because we're all involved in digital transformation, and there's a leadership paradigm emerging, we in Africa are sitting and we have our own issues, right? And I put it up here to show that the scramble for Africa was real, right? You had colonization happening across the whole continent. You had colonizers imposing values, culture, views onto Africa without any choice that we had. But also, we're also having our own digital transformation agenda. And some of the literature says that actually, in fact, digitization on the African continent has grown significantly over the last 4 years. And you and I both know that. We see the proliferation of cell phones, of digital apps, of financial transactions. But also, what we're also beginning to see is that a view that is prevalent on the African continent, that the Western leadership model is the only way we are going to make digital transformation work on the African continent. Now, how can that be so? How can we say that if Africa wants to succeed in digital transformation, we have to adopt what's coming from the West? That is one of the views. The other view says, hold on, if you go to all the business schools, most of the business schools around South Africa, if you look at the leadership program, all the leadership tools that they give you comes out of the West. I mean, for those of you who have studied in leadership, all come from the West. Not one of them point you to an African local leadership model. They all point you to the West. But the literature tells us that once you kind of are exposed to the leadership model, you go back to your work environment. After about a few years, maybe a year, you default to what you know. So obviously there's a flaw. There's a flaw in how we begin to think about what is relevant for Africa. Is the Western leadership models relevant, or are we missing something within the African context? And I think one of the research we have identified is that we are forgetting that in Africa there's a cultural context. So the Western leadership models that are coming out of America and Europe don't take into account Africa, don't take into account the African values that kind of are embedded in our societies, in our families, in our communities, because those values affect your leadership skills, affects how you make decisions as a leader. So this particular gentleman looks at this particular phenomenon and said, if you take Africa as a continent, there's something about the culture of Africa that impacts on the leader. And it kind of has helped us to understand, says that there's very much specific cultural stuff. So this is a general framework. This is not looking at a particular continent or a particular country in Africa. He's saying across the African continent, there are particular cultural things that exist here that actually make you as a leader different from the West or the East. So for example, let's take one example. Your decision as a leader. You grow up in an African community, there's an expectation that you are going to look after your family, the expectation you look after the community. So when you become a leader, your decision that you make is always influenced by that cultural context, right? Your personal achievement, you got pressure by the family to actually grow, to become CEO. So you've got all this pressure mounting on you that's coming from the family. So when you're making decisions as a leader, you're taking that into account. And I know my time is running up. And so the question then is, if the failures of the African continent is as a lack of understanding this insight, and most researchers are beginning to say, well, we either accept the fact that we're going to accept the Western views and adopt that as a model to implement digital transformation projects, or we must create our own. Create our own leadership model for Africa. Some are even saying, let's create an Ubuntu leadership model. But if you take one or the other option, so if we take a polarized view of this, you say, well, I think that the West is wrong, I'm going to develop an Ubuntu model. What they are ignoring is the fact that Ubuntu is one of about 3 or 4 cultural leadership models on the African continent. As you go to Africa, all the various cultural frameworks exist. Ubuntu is one. Ubuntu is probably only relevant for South Africa. So then you're going to eliminate the diversity of Africa. And if you say, well, no, I rather want to adopt the West, or no, then you're going to say, well, but there's a lot of the science stuff that's fairly good, isn't it? So do we want to kind of ignore the good stuff that's coming out of the West? We don't. And what April, those of you who from UCT, he kind of says, but you can't ignore what the impact of colonization has had on Africa. As we look at what's going to work for Africa, we understand that colonization had impact. Right? Impact our psyche, impact our ideas, our views on the world. And that ain't going to go away. And so as we kind of think about what is best for Africa, let's think about this kind of idea. And so for me, as I wrap up, the question that I would pose to you is, what is the appropriate model for us in Africa? Taking into account that you have a leadership paradigm that's emerging as technology is being implemented in organizations, and I've shown you that model. Taking into account that in Africa itself, it's unique in this value system, in this context, and yet we are faced as individuals, as people kind of in civil organizations with digital transformation projects. What do we do? How do we kind of look at something new? Do we take what the West has to offer, or do we kind of sit back and say, let's kind of get a blended version of the two? And that's kind of for me the big question. This Africa digital scenario is going to require a unique leadership perspective, and I don't know the answer yet. But I think it's a good starting point for us to kind of think about as we kind of move forward. My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Let's give you a round of applause. Okay. All right, so the first, what I'm going to talk about, the reason why I'm talking about 2 things and not just the one thing is because I didn't have my PhD proposal obviously ready a few weeks ago and I had to submit for this. So, yeah, watch the space. The influence of national culture, dimensional agile implementations of African software organizations. That's the first thing I'm talking about. As you can see, these things over here, courage, focus, commitment, respect, all talk to values. So if we talk about agile frameworks, how do people think about the artifacts, the processes, the roles, we must have this and that in place. But actually what it's really about is the values and the principles. That's agile. So what does that mean? That means that basically that, you know, agile is actually it's a mindset, but it's also a culture. So we're talking about in the context of software development teams. Culture plays a role in how agile frameworks are utilized and implemented. As you know what a culture is in this context, I think national culture. So culture would be beliefs, values, procedural norms, things that are encouraged either by this culture or they are discouraged by the opposed if you don't behave a certain way. So yeah, that is your national culture. So just a caveat, after my master's thesis, I thought I'm an expert in culture until I got to digital culture and the new way of culture. So for this context, in this study, this is the context of culture. It's the values that you were brought up with the first 10 years of your life, mostly. Okay, so look at things like collaboration, interaction. These are all cultural values within Agile. The things you spoke about earlier, I'm not going to elaborate on it. So I said Agile is a mindset. Okay. And so what culture is normally suitable for agility? Well, the research or the literature in the past, Agile comes from a Western point of view. Sweden and America, so Anglo-Saxon culture. So they prescribe how it should be used, but in Africa it works different, here it works different in Asia as well. Okay? So it's normally a flat structure because that's what they say, or so they believe. I'll get to the findings in a bit. And the flexible culture and so on. Yeah. So we needed to investigate this phenomenon within Africa. Okay, so I mentioned what culture is in this context. What I've come up with is this theoretical framework. Hofstede, if anyone who's a social scientist knows that that's the most popular one. The only reason I used all three is because we had data for it in Africa. So I just used the data that was there, asked questions around that in the context of Agile roles, processes, artifacts, things that Scrum is made up of, or Agile in general. A good one, if you want to do cultural studies, is this GLOBE. Stands for Global Leadership and Organizational Behavior Effectiveness. So that's a good framework to use. And I've kind of consolidated, combined them as part of my theoretical contribution, so to speak. And yeah, the problem, as I've mentioned, wasn't studied here before. And then I've basically used that framework and asked questions around the various Agile components. And it was an interpretive study, just for the hardcore science people that understand all this. It was descriptive, it was qualitative. Yeah, I used thematic, using vivo to go with my themes and stuff like that. Okay, and then my contributions finally, the important part, is basically there was this consolidated framework, and okay, this picture is just for effect. It's basically a word cloud of the findings, what people said. Okay, and then there was 43 different propositions based on all the cultural dimensions and all of that. The main things that I think that you can take away is decision making process. Yeah, so and how people, so decision making, it can either be consensus, so we all kind of agree on how it's going to work, or consent. But if there's no respect really in the team, then the consent is more like, well, yeah, I'm going to argue about it, so I'll just go with it. Or it can be this, yes, I respect you, I trust you. Those kind of values, I trust you, so we're going to, so I consent that you will make the right decision because you are the expert in that field. So that is one of the interesting findings. So interruptions, like management coming in, normally Scrum teams should be autonomous, but in hierarchical, all corporate structures, you get managers interrupting, changing priorities and so on. Participation in ceremonies, who participates should be the full team, but sometimes management barges in. Adherence to policies, prescribed practices, depends on the flexibility on that. And how teams come to agreement, yeah. So I think it was the main stuff. And I also use the complex adaptive systems theory principles to explain these findings, but I need to write another paper on that to explore it a bit more, because it's quite an interesting theory to look into. Okay, and then obviously another big one that's important, I think, for you guys is that the hierarchical culture assisted the Scrum Master in some cases when you had teams, new teams who didn't understand, trying to put something together. So sometimes it helps that the Scrum Master acts as a manager of the team or a coach to the team. And then collectivist trait or Ubuntu trait in South Africa, we found it became leaner over time. So in the beginning it might have been a little bit, if I can say, structured, but it became leaner over time. They changed the processes together over time, so it became, so like that kind of was contrary to what, having an individualist culture, what they say about that job. Okay, so the next study. So the next study what I'm talking about is about this digital culture. So now in the digital culture era, remember I said earlier that I was an expert in culture, until I realized that culture is dynamic. It's not just like you're always going to behave in this way, because that's your values and principles. We draw upon cultural resources like strategies and things like that, so that we can achieve our goals. So yeah, that's the context of this. So I explained, so the new definition of culture now is that, in this case, the integrated definition of culture would be there's collective shared values, stories as well. We tell stories, if you think about Ubuntu and in the past, our forefathers and so on, legends, etc. Cultural frames. So remember I said that we are, this is a social science, and we're constructing socially. So we create our own cultural frames, categories, rituals, practices, etc. And basically our using culture as a sense-picking tool, which is a schemata interpretation. Next. Alright. So digital technology. So I spoke about culture, now digital technology. So some definitions, what is a digital technology? Very simple, there's interfaces and each one has, for their role, they do what they need to do. But also, there's also integrated IT architectural layers. For example, one is a chip. So digital technologies, it's got a big stack of, it's a full architecture. Things like social media. I kind of like this word, I don't know how to say it, smack it, I don't know. But it's basically social media, analytics, cloud, Internet of Things. So that's sort of digital technologies. Okay. So digital culture, what is it? Basically, the digital, the person who created that technology, their values are actually embedded in that technology, wherever it comes from, right? So if you talk about digital culture, it's overarching toolkits, practices for the purpose of creating economic value. Okay, now what is digitalization? Just giving some definitions which are important. Digitalization is two things. It's the use of applications, digital technologies, right? Number one. And the second thing is so technology, and the other part is the influence that individuals have on organizations using this. So there's a social component as well. So socio-technical. Digital transformations. Okay. So how do digital transformations occur? It is through adaptive domestication of these technologies, right? Within organizations. So in each organization, they will make it own. Domestication basically means taking something from the wild, wherever it was created, bringing it in, taming it, making it your own. All right. Digital transformation also entails changes in the operational model of the businesses. Okay. And then, so cloud now is also this digital technology. So I'm looking at cloud is cloud generally, but it's what you do in the cloud. So in this case, in my context, it's going to be enterprise business planning systems, so it's applications that are hosted in the cloud, okay, for the organizations. That's where that fits in. So implementing innovations such as cloud ERP requires a fundamental change generally in the organization. Okay, so, and this digital technology it now bring in, it gives rise to a digital culture within that organization. Okay, and so there's an interplay between culture, the culture of the organization, and the culture of the technology, right? And they actually have a constraining or enabling effect on each other. So there's an interplay there, as well as domestication of it. So when digital technologies such as cloud are introduced in the organization, then the culture of the organization as well as the digital technology in the organization changes. So there's a change that way as well. And then as people use the technology, right, they actualize the things. So, okay, so our actualization work is actually socio-technical as well, because an affordance is basically a feature or the artifact, and the goal-oriented actor coming together, and that's the only way you can get an affordance, right? Well, not the only way, that's the realist way. Okay, so affordances will be different for different people in the organization because we have different goals. That's what I'm trying to get to. So there will be different needs. You know, it's like people do different things with the same features, and that's what's important to understand this phenomenon. Okay, so before what happened was people studied, you know, culture in this one-dimensional way, and now we have dynamic cultures. Okay. And so what we also want to look at are these complementaries between, I'll show you the pictures just now, between organizational culture and digital culture. There's overlaps, but there's also differences and there's similarities, right? All right, so also what's important is that in terms of cloud ERP, pre-implementation is mostly focused on, not so much post-implementation. People understand how this changes organizations. It's more, okay, are we going to adopt this or not? Okay, so we want to focus more also on the post-implementation side, but also how people domesticate it, right, so that they can use it. This is problem. Right, so there's a misalignment between the organizational culture and the digital culture. I'll skip that. The objective of the study is to look at this interplay between culture and the artifact, which is cloud ERP. So what I did was I created a model to view all of this. I think this is, so anyway. So there were actually more things there, but there's cultural, if you think about cultural resources, strategies that people use, and there's ERP features that could be, or features or things that needs that's different in organizational culture to digital culture. So I'm going to look at that interplay. And then the second study is looking at how culture enables or constrains the domestication of that technology. So very briefly, commodification, you're acquiring the technology. Appropriation, you are making it your own. The conversion phase is immobilizing that technology in the organization and expressing identity through that technology. The third study is that we want to look at the cultural frames or culture, how it enables or constrains this affordance process or actualization process over here. And then lastly, there's a link between the domestication and affordance process, right? So as you actualize user technology, you are also kind of changing and appropriating it, as well as changing your priority in terms of how you're going to mobilize this technology. Okay, so I've got a couple of research questions that you can kind of infer from what I've just told you now. And so on different levels, there's different types of contradictions that I'm going to look at in complementaries. For example, each actor has their own vision perhaps, so culture and artifact may have a different vision, so there could be misalignments there, or similarities, as well as priorities. Because if you think about how it mobilizes, priorities can change. Maybe the organization had some priorities, but now that there's digital technology, they need to reprioritize the strategy, if that makes sense. So process-wise as well, processes will change with the introduction of technology, digital technology, as well as the roles in the organization and obviously the technology landscape. Okay. So this is going to be sort of a longitudinal study, and we'll look at pre-implementation, post-implementation as well. It's going to be mostly my contributions, contributions. It's going to be mostly extending certain theories, like social theories, computing values framework that I've shown you, and I extend it with its ERP features and goal-oriented actors. And then, the purpose is to understand, okay, understanding a holistic integrated perspective inside of organizations. And then domestication for that study, that's also a mid-range theory that I would like to extend. We will look at enabling and constraining factors. And there's some other empirical contributions for actualization of it. We'll extend that as well. Look at the interplay between culture and the ERP. And lastly, there's constraining and enabling mechanisms between the domestication and actualization process. So to view that as well. Okay. Thank you very much. Acknowledgements. So my supervisor was HOD at UCT, Maureen Tanner. Thank you to her in her absence. And thank you to the guardian, my co-supervisor, Cesar Art, and my manager for having me be here as well, allowing me to be here. And yeah, so I work for Panda Software as well, and we basically deliver retail solutions for customers.
Okay, so I've been in the industry for quite some time. And like Mervyn indicated earlier, and like Kevin indicated also, I've seen this story play out over and over, where we adopt a different culture, we adopt a different technology, and we try to implement it in an environment where it is not conducive. Okay, I think this should be fine. Here we go. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is what prompted me to do research and to understand the environment better, okay? So the agenda is ways of change. We're going to look at ecosystems. We're going to look at the ecosystem that actually allowed us the empirical data to conclude the study. And we're looking at the framework that was built and the implications and findings. So every year or 1,000, couple of 100 years, our industries goes through a bit of a change, a wave of change. We went from the Iron Age from the Stone Age to the Iron Age to the Industrial Age. Then the information wave comes, and then the digital wave comes. And each time we experience those type of waves, our thought processes change on how we manage certain things. Okay, so we've got a few ecosystems. For example, each time these waves change, the business ecosystem changes and new ecosystems is created. So we're looking at the business ecosystem, which centers around the firm and its environment. And over past 300, 400, 500 years, maybe 1,000 years, that ecosystems change, new regulations is introduced, new competitive measures is also introduced. When your business ecosystem changes, the innovation ecosystem changes because new things becomes available to consider. New things becomes available to consider. And when your innovation ecosystem changes, and the innovation that was created, so an innovation that is created allows for new platforms to be interrogated, investigated, used. So, and the platform ecosystem is one of those innovation ecosystems. This is where everybody comes together. Like in our case, we got AWS, we got Google, we got Facebook. These are all social media, but different type of platforms, still technology. Okay? So, the ecosystem still present today in academia and in practice the challenges of the modern age. It's like some authors state that despite the emphasis on the co-evolution of the firm's capabilities, there is little explanation of how the firms mutually adapt. Now, it's not just the firm that adapt, but sometimes the firm that prompt government to adapt also. Okay? So this is where we try to make the magic happen, to view and understand these ecosystems from a multifaceted environment. Okay, so the data that we use came from a mobile ecosystem, which means it's mobile payments. You've got your bank here, you've got your mobile network operator there, and then you've got a payment system sitting on the outside. You've got your customers on the one side, and you've got your agents on the one side. Here you've got your formal and you've got your informal economy. So we use this particular model because one of the reasons was South Africa is so multifaceted, both formal and informal economy, which is quite well balanced. So we used our empirical data coming from this particular environment. At the time it was quite new to South Africa, and this is the M-Pesa environment that was introduced for a while. I think it was 2013, 2014. They never really kicked off because we had such a good and coherent, robust banking system. So it was never going to work. But it was a good environment to gather some data. So, what I needed to understand, I had two questions. The first one was, how does an IT artifact, how does this evolve? How does it evolve, the IT artifact? And I used a theory called actor network theory to answer that particular question. So what actor network theory basically tells me is, I've got HPC. I'm going to introduce HPC. We've got Ndau. So I've got the actor on the one. I've got the actor on the one side. I've got the actor on the one side, and I've got the goal of the actor on the other side. In our case, our actor is DSI. It would be DSI, and the goal of DSI is to implement state-of-the-art high-performance computing environment. I've got the organization, I've got the business, and I've got the user. So we are, from our side, it's maybe Nikki's. We've got the business environment that make use of it, the universities, the government, some other industries, and we've got the user. So what happened was, first, you need to know what is the problem? How do we how do we come about this? Why do we need the HPC system? Okay, now we establish, okay, because of this and because the West need to move and we got some new science and ideas that's coming through. Then the next step was, who do we need to interest, okay? Now we need to interest, okay, we've got the universities, we're going to give you a better system because we can calculate better results for even old type of research that you've done. We interest the technologists to say, look, South Africa is looking to develop and to move forward. And the next one is now, once we know who to interest, we need to enroll them. Now DSI gave us a budget to say, this is how much you can do, and then now we start the process of enrollment. And once, before we actually start the process of enrollment, there's what we call obstacles or problems or people who's not willing to accept the terms of what the actors set up there. During that period, you negotiate the terms, the problems or the obstacles. Once you pass that point, you move to the next point, which is enrollment. Now, with enrollment, you get the universities involved, you get the scientific community involved, you get businesses involved. Once you're done with enrollment, and then now we know who the users is, we've got the budget, we go out and we go purchase, procure, and implement Ndau, the HPC ecosystem, cloud computing, could be web services. Okay, so that is how I solve my question on how does this HPC ecosystem evolve. Next question that was a bit troubling is like, okay, if it evolves that way, how does it impact a multifaceted economic system, which is both formal and informal? Now, this is how I answer the technical part. How does this part actually evolve? So now the next part was a bit social, so I need to understand now. Because I've implemented this, the Ndau, so who's benefiting from it? How does it impact South Africa as a whole? Okay? So the next theory I used was called structuration. So what structuration say is, we've got society of institutions and social systems where culture comes in, where leadership comes in, institutions and culture. Okay? So now we've got leadership, we've got different types of people who lead, we've got different types of leadership, and we've got different types of cultural social systems. Now for these two to be created all the time, there's a process. So new leadership will create new cultures, new leadership, old leadership will force new structures to appear. So that's called the structuration process. So what structuration basically do, that process is that Kevin spoke about earlier about actors, okay? It means that we've got agency, it means which, so when you have an actor, and there's agency in the structure, the structure consists of rules and resources, and these are culture, create new language. So in order for a culture to exist, or in order for new cultures to exist, there must be a previous culture. So culture can constrain and it can enhance. So coming back to Ubuntu. So we've got a culture like, let's say Ubuntu, something very popular and many others similar within Africa. Now, if we have Ubuntu, it works for us as Africans on one environment, maybe not in technology. So now we use Ubuntu as a platform to enhance something, maybe digital Ubuntu. But for us to do that, we're going to have to look at what is the other actors that is involved. It could be the government. It will be government. It will be regulatory environments. Okay. But now what it means is it enables and constrains. So that cycle it continues. But it is there. It's mostly formulated in the minds of people. The challenges that we have in terms of leadership and Ubuntu is that we've got current leaders that apply westernized ideas and it doesn't conform to regional cultures, leadership styles, and there is there's a gap between what the people of that particular environment, region, understand and where these people are pushing them or want them to go. Okay? So this is what we call structuration theory, where we actually answer the question of, so how does this impact society? Then, when it impacts society, normally it impacts from a contextual perspective. The challenge we have when it comes to context, we universalize context. Okay, if this is the context. So context is like, okay, we are in a formal economy, which is similar to the US and the West and maybe to China, because we use ATM cards and so it must be the same, which is not the case. So now so far I've used a French model, British model, and then to answer the question of how it impacts the context of our society, I used a theory called knowledge creation. Okay, so what knowledge creation says is what we currently doing here. Yeah, the first one, which is originating or socialization, we're socializing. Okay, now, in fact, what I did last night to prepare my slides and to have discussions with other people is to socialize, okay? To get my results from the university now, I had to get feedback from my supervisor. To get my results from my work, my KRA for the year, I'll discuss it with my manager. So now once I socialize, I move to externalization. What I'm doing now, I give a presentation, I tell you guys, okay, this is the case, and this is how we actually externalize, and then we move to combination. You take what I say, you go read up, and you combine your thoughts process with what I've just said. And then after that, you internalize. Okay, so Ricardo said that, Mervin said that, and Cohen said that, so let's take all together, and I'm internalizing. But that cycle is a continuous cycle, and that's a Japanese model. There you've got face-to-face discussions, the other one is peer-to-peer. When you combine, it's group, and then the other one is on-site. It can be virtual, and it depends. And this is also just another way of indicating, okay, now, when you create context, context is not just where it happened. Context is cultural. Context is in our minds. Context is a relationship that you have with, which is maybe different between a husband and a wife, with a boss and an employee. But you create context. So that context is going to be like, for example, face-to-face. It could be originating, which the Japanese call ba, which is ba is just space and time. It was created in this space and time. So you've got originating, you've got interacting, you've got exercising, and you've got cyber bar. So there's virtual environments to create context. There's face-to-face environments to create context. And there's also, okay, so I've answered basically 3 questions. I said, how did this thing evolve? Explain to me who was involved with this, okay? And I used the active network theory. The next one I used was structuration theory to explain to me how does this impact society, and how is this context that it impact, how it is specific to that particular environment and not universal. When we answer questions, when we implement software, when we do big projects, we do it universally. We take the advice of the person that did it for France. The implementation for Japan could be for Rwanda. The challenge is the context differ. And that's also the impact, okay? We can continue. So I combined those models to say, my first part of my data collection goes, and I'm going to just trace how this network evolved, okay? The second part, once I've got all the data, I'm going to analyze how the structures occur and how it impacts society. And the third one was, how do I create context? Okay? How does this context actually occur? What type of context is created in order to understand the broad environment? So that was my framework, okay? Then, just to conclude, So I have three implications. Through one for practice, and as the network grows, the actor network grows, economic development occurs, it becomes imperative to implement mediating processes, methodologies to allow the IT artifact to transition from mainstream, from where it is to mainstream. So there's going to be a period where we actually just do it barely, and then we would migrate to a more mainstream environment. This transitioning can be a slow process of discovery, since economic transition is also slow, and it's not always a case when we can just do it fast. There's implications to theory. Then we've got implications to practice. Organizations spend massive amounts of capital on ICT initiatives. Economies and deemed, in economies deemed as developing countries. We have this with many of our ecosystems, for example, where we say we're going to implement a system to you. Once we've done that, we help them getting it up and running, and then 6 months down the line, it goes down, and it stays down for maybe a year until they get somebody that can work on it again. So those capital investment is also quite significant. So new industrial economic environments harbor a wealth of different factors that may impact ICT for development initiatives, and may also allow for a more in-depth learning experience for the organization. And then there's an implication for method. The type of theory or the way I've created my theoretical framework was quite novel and new. Nobody's done it. So that was my contribution to theory, apart from the other two implications. So there was a bit of, so what I also brought in is very few people who do, in fact, I couldn't find someone that can actually contextualize specific to the conditions. Because when we contextualize, we'll say, okay, I was in Mbombela, I was in Kruger, and the policeman came to arrest me. Now when we start contextualizing, I was in Skokuza and the policeman came to arrest me. When I start contextualizing, no, I had a couple of beers and I was a bit tipsy and I walk in the road, so now we come and you get more detail. And then there was this police car who warned me not to walk in the road, and then I got cocky with the policeman, so now you start building the context. We don't always get that type of feedback, and a policeman in Germany would be different from a policeman in Canada, would be different from a policeman in South Africa. And I think that concludes the basic findings of what my research was all about. So first, I wanted to understand the environment. How does this evolve or occur? Second, I want to understand how does this impact society? And third is, what is the specific contextual conditions that gave rise to these type of conditions when it's in society? And that concludes my research. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
But you didn't think your supervisor and your line manager and your organization, did you hear that
Yes, I did. When I graduated many years back.
Yeah.
So now I own the research.
Yeah,
So yes, thank you also for my CSR colleagues. Thank you also for all the conversations we had, Dr. Mabakani. That late nights, 1 o'clock I go home from the office. So, okay. So also just to conclude is, we sometimes think, if I can just give you guys a simple, what also triggered, is that it is exactly the question you asked. The person that is always lead with a heavy hand is not going to change his style or method. He can only change his behavior. Then, so what happened is, we've got episteme, the learning environment, the knowing, the knowledge environment. Episteme, we've got the universities here, which teach us all these things about the subject matter and what we do, what we create. Then we got the guy, once he's finished, he's going to apply the technique, and he's going to learn the technique. Another learning or knowing environment is called techne, Aristotle's three worlds. Episteme, techne, these are book knowledge, your type of discoveries you do around theories. Then you get your technique, your violinist, your bricklayer, the guy that just knows which, when to create a virtual machine for whatever he's going to need, what type of environment. But, and that is always a challenge we have, these two go well together. The one at the universities don't teach us. Although we get practical experience, is practical intelligence, which we call phronesis. And as we interact, while we have this type of conversations, while we actually interact with the person themselves, you understand not just what you've learned here, but how you're going to broad your message across to this person in order to sell your product, your idea, or what. So that small streetwise component, that was also one of the outliers we found, which is phronesis in our study, is that, so what happened was, the telecoms introduced a mobile payment system, but they did not introduce the fact that it's just a payment system, normal system. So you put money into the bank and you can withdraw the money. So what the guys did, and this is the streetwise, because he knows his community, he actually go out every day, collect money from all the walkers at the statuary, and he deposited it. So they no longer go home with all that money. So he created a new product or service for that particular. So those are things we don't get. Although it's an idea, sometimes, but we can't blame the guys that want to focus on the science and the technology. Hence the reason I say we're going to have the mediators. Normally this would have been the C student, but now A students are also becoming aware about the benefits of being streetwise. Okay, not that they're going to go and walk in Soweto and start so they do a lot more voluntary projects so that they can understand how people think and how they. So those are the type of environments we do. The challenge is that they are all of it takes a lot of energy to learn, to rethink, to go and. But I think at the end of the day, there is going to be a challenge, not a challenge, there's going to be a split between the guy who's doing the leading is not always going to be the subject matter expert. If it's not required, it's not required. The challenge is that the subject matter experts always challenge the leader. What do you know? And I think it shouldn't be the case. But it might change, it's exactly what you say. Leadership becomes now a process, a practice, a process where we actually can change a couple of things. I think that's it. That concludes my presentation. So
okay,
thank you very much for sharing.
Okay, thank you.